Welcome, everybody. I'm so happy to be here. I want to thank Stir Trek for allowing me to come to speak to you about the power of storytelling at a tech conference. And so some of you might be thinking, why are we talking about storytelling at a tech conference? And what difference do stories make? Well, in my mind, they make the most difference. And hopefully, by the end of the talk, if anybody is a little bit skeptical, you will understand that they make a difference too. And I'm not going to make you stand up or move around, but I am going to make you participate. So you might need to write some things down. I'm going to ask for some audience participation here. So hopefully we can actively engage in this and we can come out with a story together. And that's how we're going to get started. We're going to start with an activity. So if you're feeling skeptical, hold that skepticism. And I'm going to ask you to write down one word that describes you. And nobody's allowed to use the word complex. That's cheating. I want you to think about it. I know that can be a really hard question to answer. It is asking you to boil down who you are into one singular word. But I want you to write it down. I'm going to give you a second. Maybe that word is energetic. Maybe it's passionate, trusting, chaotic, curious. What do you have? Share your words. Dedicated. I like it. What else? Free-spirited. Free-spirited. That's a good one. Imaginative. All right. That's awesome. So hold on to those words. We're going to keep thinking about them throughout this talk and maybe build on that idea a little bit. Now I want you to think about some nouns. I want you to think about names of people or places that are important to you. And I want you to jot those down. You don't have to jot down a full story around that. Nobody else has to understand what you're talking about but you. But I want you to write something down and it makes sense to you. As you're thinking about those things, think about an event. Is there an event that happened with that person or in that place that made a difference in your life, that made you feel a certain way? Start to think about these things a little bit more deeply as we're building it out. Think about a story that you would want to tell someone else. It might be the story of a first time. My go-to is always an origin story, which is makes sense for the movie that everyone is seeing tonight. It might be the first time you learned to code, the first time you gardened, the first time you fell in love. But think of a story that's meaningful to you. Why are we talking about these stories? Why are we thinking about the details that we remember, and why are we recalling them? Well, it's because humans are hardwired for storytelling in a couple of different ways. One, there's neurological connections that happen when we hear stories. Neurons pass messages and our brains light up when we connect to another person who's telling us a story. Oxytocin is produced when we hear a story that we feel connected to. And so we have this neurological and these biological reactions because we are built for storytelling. Part of the brain called the hippocampus also helps us to remember stories. It helps us to remember people, and it helps us to remember those experiences. So all of these parts of our body are made to ensure that we remember these stories and that we remember these experiences. Now, when we think about stories, you might think about the plot diagram from high school or grade school, and feel free to groan. Maybe you didn't enjoy that portion of English. I myself was a college English teacher for 10 years before coming into tech. And so a lot of times we think that our stories come from predictability and that we follow a certain path, right? We have the exposition, and that tells the story of the person where they are now. Okay, so where are you meeting them today? And so as I go through this talk, you're gonna learn a little bit about me. You're gonna learn about Bekah as a person 6 years ago. That's the exposition. And the rising action is something that happens to incite a change. Why did you have to make a change in your life? And you think about that. The climax is that very point where you make the decision. Am I going to go back to being the same Bekah, or am I going to go forward in this adventure and be a new person? And all of these things are predictable. These are the stories that we like to watch. These are all of the Avengers movies, right? They follow this plot line. But what we've learned from studies is that our brains also connect disjointed stories. So if you want to make an impact on someone, it doesn't necessarily have to be a story with a coherent plot line, because our lives are not coherent plot lines. There was a study done by Brendan Cohen Sheehy in a team in California where they took a group of people and they told them stories under an fMRI machine. Okay, so they scanned their brains and they were looking at all of these disjointed stories that they were telling them. The stories weren't coherent, and it's much easier to remember a coherent story. So the next day, they brought all of these people back, they put them under the fMRI machine, and they said, "Tell us the stories that we told you yesterday." And what they found was those disjointed stories, the ones that shouldn't have created connected paths in the brain, did. So our brain works really hard to connect the things that we learn about, the experiences that we have, and the people that we meet every day, so we can remember them and we can remember those experiences. Good storytelling takes practice and thought. Some stories are going to be more effective than others. And so I think that it's really important that you tell stories, but you also experiment with the stories that you tell. It's important to get out of your comfort zone, to be vulnerable. Why? Because when we do that, we are more likely to connect to someone else. That vulnerability is the thing that often creates that connection made by oxytocin. And so when we're open with others, whether that's about our struggles, about experiences that we've had, we're more likely to make that connection. This is why everybody loves a good underdog story. It allows us to experience the plotline of the underdog. They seemingly were going to fail, and yet they succeeded. And when we hear those stories, it also makes us feel like, hey, maybe I can succeed too. And so finding ways to connect to other people can help us to better understand ourselves and those around us. It's easier to capture the hearts of your viewer and your listener if you experiment in that way and you're vulnerable. Okay, so here's me being vulnerable here. Before I was a developer, before I was developer experience lead at OpenSauce, before I came into tech, I was a mom who had spent 10 years teaching college English, and I had given birth to my 4th child. And during that experience, I knew something was wrong. I felt a pain that I had never, I couldn't describe to you the depth of the pain that I felt after having my child. And I told the doctor, something is wrong. And they said, well, sometimes this stuff happens to moms of 4. And I thought, pretty sure this is not a feeling that happens to moms of 4 or anyone else. But they sent me home for the weekend and said I'd be fine. I was still having some pretty horrific symptoms when I saw my OBGYN the next week. And I told her about what I was going through, and she said, "You're not my problem." I wasn't a patient. I wasn't a person. I was a problem, and I was somebody else's problem. And so through this experience, I had to find another doctor, and I had to fight to get a diagnosis. It turns out that I had a hole the size of a 50-cent piece, that's about like that big, between 2 of my organs connecting each other. They had ruptured into each other. I'm pretty sure that's not something that normally happens to moms of 4, but like, I don't know, maybe someone out here is medical and can tell me. 6 weeks later, I had surgery. When I was in the hospital, they didn't properly cap my morphine pump, and I overdosed on morphine. And so then they had to give me Narcan, which undoes all of the effects of the morphine and I had just had abdominal surgery to remove one of my organs and to repair another one. So when I went home, I was having a little bit of a hard time. I had my first panic attack. I was diagnosed with PTSD about a year later, and I was depressed. And I knew that I could never go back to being old Bekah. There was something that changed. And I knew I was going to have to make a decision, but I didn't know what that decision was. What I knew was my body had failed me, my brain had failed me, and I was broken. And then my husband, who is a second career developer, said, "Hey, you should learn how to code." I was like, what? I can't even think straight. That doctor telling me I wasn't her problem, that memory cycled in my head over and over and over every single day. When I would go to bed at night, I would wake up because I thought that I wasn't breathing anymore. I would count my breaths. I would time them. I knew this is not rational. I am breathing. I'm not going to stop breathing. It doesn't make sense. And I tried to talk my brain out of it. I tried to tell it, "You're fine." But my brain wouldn't listen. And then here he was saying, "Learn how to code." And so finally, I was like, all right, well, if I try free code camp, will you just shut up about it? And this funny thing happened. When I started to learn how to code, those memories that were cycling in my head, they stopped. I had relief for the first time in a year. And so coding became therapy, then it became a hobby, a passion, a community, and then a career change. After learning to code for a little while on free code camp, I decided to apply for boot camp. And this is a real moment of change in my life. I still was feeling pretty isolated. Like I was the only one that could possibly understand what I had gone through. I was the only one in the United States whose organs ruptured into each other that year. Maybe even the year before and the year after. It doesn't really happen to people. So I applied to Flatiron School Boot Camp. And I feel like I cheated my way into boot camp because I got a full scholarship, which made me able to go there. But to get the scholarship, you had to write an essay. And that's a little bit like cheating, right? Because I spent 10 years as a college English teacher. But then I felt cheating even more because they're like, "Why do you want to go here?" And I'm like, "Well, I almost died, and this is going to help me heal," right? Like, how could they not give me the full scholarship? So I'm sorry to all of the other people who applied for Flatiron Scholarship at that point. But what happened next was really an amazing part of the story because we had an educational coach. And my educational coach's name was Katie McKenna. She had read my scholarship essay. And in our first one-on-one, she said, "Hey, Bekah, I've been through a trauma. Do you mind if I share?" I said, "Sure, Katie." Katie had been run over by a semi-truck. She actually wrote a book called How to Get Run Over by a Truck. It is very, very fantastic. And she talked about how the doctors treated her, and she talked about the feelings that she had. And in that moment, for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel alone. And I realized it didn't matter that her organs didn't rupture into each other. She was saying the same words that I had said to myself. And I realized that there were other people out there that had gone through this. Her doctors told her she would never walk again. She walked again. Her doctors told her she would never have kids. This year, her daughter is now 1. She'd overcome all of the odds and all of the obstacles, and I felt like she brought me up with her because she chose to tell her story. So why am I telling you all of this? Well, the connections that we find through sharing our stories, those connections are often forgotten. They're deprioritized. We think of them as frivolous. We go from one thing to the next thing, and we never stop to make those connections. And I think now that it's more important than ever. According to Ted Bauer and the neuroscience of storytelling, when we see or hear a story, the neurons in our brain fire in the same pattern as the speakers. This is known as neural coupling. So what does this mean? In other words, our brains are creating patterns to make them similar to the person that we're talking to. We make an impact when we share those stories and someone connects to those stories. It makes us feel a part of something, a part of a group, a community. It makes us not feel alone. This connection with Katie wasn't just an emotional connection, it was a physiological connection. It changed me. From that moment on, I was able to heal. What happens in these moments when we open up and we become vulnerable? Well, we make friends with people, we convince people, we're more likely to trust them, to change, to innovate, and to grow. All of these things happen when we are willing to share our stories. All right, let's back up and talk about oxytocin for a second. Oxytocin is produced when we trust someone. And this is why it's important to build these relationships of trust. When Katie shared her story with me, oxytocin was produced. This allows us to be empowered. It allows us to feel motivated. When we are trusted and shown that the other person is willing to trust us, then we are more likely to take risks, to be transparent, to grow ourselves. And when we feel comfortable doing that, we're more likely to be supportive collaborators and to be innovators. Oh, we're not there yet, sorry. Kitty has made a career out of this connection. Not only has she written a book about it, but she also has a consultancy helping other people. In the book, Stories That Stick by Kendra Hall, she shares this really great story. So she had gotten onto a plane, and there were two elderly women on the plane as well. And one of the women asked the flight attendant, "Can you please help me get my luggage into the overhead?" And the flight attendant said to her, "I'm sorry, I can't, because of my contract, I'm not allowed to do that." Well, the situation got a little bit out of hand, and there was some arguing that happened, and the flight attendant said that she was going to call security on these two elderly women because they were arguing. And then one of them said, "I'm sorry, we haven't flown in a really long time, and we're just very excited to be able to go to this family reunion together." And in that moment, the flight attendant's face softened, and she said, she told them the stories of her Midwestern roots and the family reunions that they had had. And so in that moment, a moment that could have gone really badly, where security could have been called, instead a connection was formed because one of the women was willing to share a little bit about the story of what they were doing. By the end of that flight, the women exited the plane and they gave the flight attendant a hug and they moved on. But that tiny piece of that story was enough to make a connection and to totally change that situation. All right, now we're here. Okay, so I want you to think about your stories again. I want you to think about how you felt connected in that moment, in one of the moments that you wrote down, okay? So maybe that was, again, an event. Maybe it was an origin story. And I want you to think about what the strongest emotion was, and I want you to write that down. It could be angry. It could be hopeful, happy, full of love or joy. Go ahead and share. What words have you written down? Torn, that's a good one. What was it? Connected. One more. Desperation, good. You want to think about the strongest feelings that you felt, and you want to think, why did I feel that way? Maybe there's a situation where you're in an interview and you're getting no response from the interviewer, right? Blank slate. Their face isn't giving you any kind of response at all, and then you say something, and then they slightly smirk, and you know that you've got it, right? You can feel proud in that moment. Maybe it's a time that you felt overwhelmed by giving a talk in front of an audience of people, and you overcame that fear and you shared. Maybe it's a time where you were diagnosed with ADHD, and then suddenly your life clicked and you understood it a little bit better. When we have these strong feelings, oxytocin is released, and oxytocin helps us to remember those feelings, good ones and bad ones. So as you're thinking about the stories that you'll tell and how you'll tell those stories, think about the impact that has. What stories will you tell, and how will people remember those stories? In the last couple of years, we have lost the ability and the opportunity to connect. In the pandemic, there was this despair, right? This isolation, this aloneness. There were fewer chance meetings. We were all trying to make sense of a world where we felt stuck, where we felt alone. And I'm worried that during that time, we lost some of our ability to connect. And instead of connecting, we choose productivity. We forget that it's okay to stop in the grocery store and chat in the ice cream aisle. We forget to connect with our neighbors. We run from one thing to the other, and we forget to make those personal connections. Prior to the pandemic, I was a remote worker, but I didn't feel the depths of despair that I did when we hit the pandemic. I didn't feel that impact of isolation in that remote work. And I think that the difference is we didn't have a choice when it came to the pandemic. We didn't choose remote work. We were forced into remote work. And I remember the moment where I felt that despair. I had started my first job coding. I was about 8 months in, and I finally was feeling like I hit the groove. Like I can communicate well, I knew what I was doing, and then we got a message from the kids' school, and they said, come pick up your kids' work while we get over this pandemic in the next 3 weeks. And then I got a call from my boss that said, hey, when you get in, want to meet up? So after picking up all of my kids' work, I got home, and I found out that we had both lost our jobs, my boss and I. And so in that moment, I found myself interviewing really for the first time, because my first job was a conversation. Hey, you can do this stuff? Seems like it'll be a good fit. What do you think? Yeah, this will be a great fit. Never really interviewed. And so now I'm interviewing for the first time, and I have 4 kids at home, trying to school at home, all of them. Nobody knows what's going on, right? You're trying to explain this to your kids. You're all in isolation. And the moment that I remember the most clearly, I was in this interview. It was maybe my second interview. And one of my 5-year-old at the time walks past my computer into my bathroom, pees with the door open. And I'm like, this is absurd. What is happening in this world? The moment the world came crashing down, right? I found myself, I was crying every night. Like, what is going on? And then it finally hit me. I knew these feelings. I had been here before. I knew this despair. But this time, I'm not the only one that feels it, because everybody else in the world feels it. We're all in this together, isolated together, right? And so that's when I put out a tweet and I said, hey, does anybody want to meet up for virtual coffee? What started as me reaching out to others generically on Twitter turned into a community of people in tech that meets up twice a week, and we're still doing it today. Well, we do it on Tuesdays and Thursdays, so we did it yesterday. But the point is, why are we still coming together? Because we need that connectedness. We need that opportunity to share with each other. We need that opportunity to find a group of people that we can trust and we can be open with and vulnerable with. And it comes in all different shapes and forms. In this world, I feel like we are consumed by productivity. We prioritize productivity over connection. We go from meeting to meeting, and we opt out of all of the personal and the fun and the interactive things. We need to figure out how to connect remotely. In Make Us React, the neuroscience of narrative, the author says, if you treat me well, in most cases, my brain will synthesize oxytocin, and this will motivate me to treat you well in return. Guess what? If you're going from meeting to meeting, and you're checking the boxes, you're not making those connections. There's not going to be that motivation to treat other people well. This is why it's important. We're losing the opportunities to connect with others in meaningful ways. I want to be clear that I think that this can happen in a remote environment, 100%, but we have to make space for it to happen. How do we get started? Well, get started by creating those moments of trust with each other. I was listening to, it was maybe an audiobook, and the author was talking about there's this thing that happens where we're creating all of these meetings, and often we don't need all of those meetings. And sometimes what people really want is just to spend some time saying, hey, how you doing to other people? But instead of saying like, hey, can we meet up for 15 minutes and just talk about something that's not work? We make an excuse to say we need to talk about work, and then you try to jam the rest of it in. It is okay to ask somebody, do you want to meet to talk about things that aren't work for 15 minutes, or 30 minutes, or an hour? That's okay. And if your boss says, well, that's not being very productive, yes, it is. It is being more productive than 90% of the meetings that are probably already on your calendar. You can send them to me, I'll tell them that too. This impacts our work environment by having these trustworthy relationships that we build. And this is one of the simplest ways that we can do it, through talking to other people and sharing our stories, our everyday experiences. And when we don't do that, it leads us to isolation and to burnout. We don't want to be in burnout. It's the worst. Don't be another coworker, a support person, or a cog in the wheel. Think about, who is this person in front of me? I'm not Bekah, the developer experience lead at OpenSauce. That's not who I am. That's what I do, right? Find out about who someone is. We are complex human beings, and we deserve to be thought of that way. Have an understanding of who people are. This allows us to feel openness, empathy, to resolve conflict, and to disagree. In a previous job, I was going through the interview process, and it's maybe one of my all-time favorite interviews. It was with a future coworker, and we disagreed the entire time. It was great. We just sat there and argued with each other. And in that moment, I knew I could work with him. We would work really well together. We didn't leave that meeting on the same page, but we left that meeting with an understanding that we respected each other and that we were willing to hear the other person out. And that's key to feeling like you can be trusted and that you can grow in that role. We all are working to achieve common goals, and we want to be able to spread this information to each other, whether that's a teammate, a partner, somebody that you're volunteering with. We want to create a common culture that helps us to understand each other. Well, how do you create culture? It's more than just good benefits, company policies, and HR. It's created by the people who make up the company, how they interact with each other, and how leadership interacts with the team. If you want your company to be invested in the work, then you have to start by investing in your team. Who knows a good way to do that? Storytelling, maybe. Within a company, Storytelling allows for a shared understanding of the mission, key priorities, and clarity on the creation process. So let's take a look at some companies that use storytelling well. Anybody familiar with Warby Parker? Okay, so Warby Parker is an eyeglasses manufacturer. How many people here wear contacts or glasses? I also wear contacts and glasses, and they can be very expensive, right? Like, it's pretty easy to drop $1,000 trying to make sure that you can see the world in front of you. And the founder of Warby Parker discovered that, I think he was in Europe during grad school, lost his glasses, and then discovered he couldn't afford to buy a new pair of glasses. So he spent that first semester squinting his way through grad school until he could buy one. And what he learned was there was like a monopoly on glasses manufacturing, and that's why they're so expensive. And so Warby Parker was started to create an alternative to provide access to clear vision to people for a fraction of the price. They designed glasses in-house, they engaged with customers directly, and then they were able to even provide higher quality and really cool looking eyewear for a fraction of the price, right? And Warby Parker tells their story. I was on Instagram a couple of months ago, and I'm a sucker for all Instagram sponsored ads. I have so much stuff that has been purchased. I spent $100 on these things that you drop in your toilet bowl. They're like, you don't have to clean your toilet for 10 years. It was a good story so far. That is not panning out. But we think about that story is effective. This is why I'm such a sucker, and I know it every time. Along with this, okay, Warby Parker says, we also believe that everyone has the right to see. 2.5 billion people around the world need glasses, but don't have access to them. Of these, 624 million cannot effectively learn or work due to the severity of their visual impairment. To help address this problem, we work with a handful of partners worldwide to ensure that for every pair of glasses sold, a pair is distributed to someone in need. To date, over 8 million pairs of glasses have been distributed through our Buy a Pair, Give a Pair program. I don't know about you, but I feel a little bit of emotions when I hear that. Wow, what a beautiful gift. And also, how sad is that there have been so many people without access to critical support because of the situation. We get that this is a story of being in need and of recognizing other people in need. A story that also kind of motivates us to support that cause. Hey, I'll buy from Warby Parker next time because they're doing good work, because they recognize the people in need, not just, I'm selling you some glasses and I'm going to make a profit. I mean, I'm sure that they care about profit too, but that's not what they say. Hey, we're selling you these glasses so we can make money and put it in our pocket, right? That's not an effective story. But these motivating stories that motivate us to be part of the cause, it's a familiar story that we see in a lot of different forms. It's something that we see when we look at popular movies, when we see unlikely groups coming together, when someone shares a connection. There are great ways to create this connection within our companies too. You do it by telling the mission. You do it through mentoring, through leadership, onboarding. There are always opportunities to tell stories. The company 3M, they make the Post-it note, they make a lot of other things. And actually kind of funny, this is a total tangent, but the last time I was on a plane, I was sitting next to a salesperson who sold adhesive to 3M, and I was like, hey, I know all about their storytelling culture. And then we talked about that. Total aside. 3M believes in a story-intensive culture, and they also say that they have a strategic narrative that guides their entire company. I think it's really, really fascinating. And I'll tell you one story. One of their lead scientists was in the choir at church and found that he was very annoyed when the piece of paper that was marking the spot in the hymnal kept falling out. So what did he do? He created the Post-it note. He had a need, he had a problem, and he solved that problem through innovation, right? And now, I don't know, I have Post-it notes all over. I'm a huge Post-it note person. But this is all to say that this story inspires people. Maybe you'll remember the name 3M now. I feel like we all know what Post-it notes are, but did you know that 3M is the company that makes Post-it notes? I don't know, maybe you're better than I am, but it's the same thing in terms of documentation. Documentation doesn't stick, right? Why? Because it's often very bland and dry, and there's no connection. You can't connect with a stale piece of bread. Finding ways to integrate storytelling into these processes is going to make us more effective. It's the same thing with mentoring, right? So you'll often find that when you are mentoring somebody new, or maybe you're onboarding a new person in your team, what do? You have to meet with them. The boss says, everybody needs to meet with this new teammate. And I don't know about you, I get super awkward in those situations. We're just both sitting there staring at each other on the screen, what are we supposed to say to each other? Hey, I was told I had to meet with you, so. And so then what comes next? The next question is, tell me about yourself. I don't know. I don't know about myself. I'm not really sure, sorry. What do you say? In this situation, as a mentor, as the experienced person on the team, instead of saying, tell me about yourself, you start the conversation. Tell that person about you. Be the example first, because that creates the connection. The person who's being onboarded or mentored is more than likely the more nervous person in that situation. And when we create that trustworthy bond, then they're going to be maybe a little bit more willing to share their story and to tell you who they are, right? And when you tell them who you are, if you're vulnerable in that story and in that conversation, that's going to produce that oxytocin. That's going to cause the brain to light up and fire those neurons. It's going to cause that connection to happen, them to trust you, and to feel comfortable doing their job and being your teammate. When you are vulnerable, that connection is more likely to happen. You are more likely to be impactful in that moment. All right, so let's think a little bit again. Let me see what my next slide looks like. Yes, we're gonna get there, okay? So we're gonna think about this. We're gonna think about who you are. We already have that one word that describes us. And now we're gonna take that one word and we're going to turn it into a story about us. Okay, so let's think about constructing your story. You wanna think about who your audience is. Okay, so in this scenario, I'm going to ask you to write some things down again, but I want you to pick a particular audience. So maybe this is your teammate, your boss, your partner, your kids. And I want you to think about how that changes your tone, your word choice, and the details that you share. And I want you to focus on one example. Okay, so we talked about a particular moment that made us feel a certain way. Think about the details around that moment. Now, there are a lot of the details around my trauma that I didn't share with you. I'm fine to share whatever anybody wants to learn about, but I spared you the gory details of all of the things that happened because I don't know that's really appropriate for this audience. But about a year after I went through this experience and I had yelled very loudly online about what a terrible experience it was at that initial hospital, the administrators reached out to me and they said, do you want to have a meeting? And I said, yeah. And so I went in there in front of 5 hospital administrators, and I brought my dad, who had worked at the hospital for 30 years, for support. And in that moment, I wasn't there to share my story, to just tell it. I was there to make an impact, and I was there to seek change. Because if I was treated that way, chances are there were a lot more people that were treated that way. And so I went in there Armed with knowledge, I had done so much research, I knew all of the medical terminology, and I presented it to them factually, how things happen, shared the response. I brought with me studies on why it's important for hospitals and doctors to apologize to their patients, and I presented them with that information. And I'll never forget, the CEO of the hospital said, "Are you medical?" I was like, "No, I'm an English teacher." And he looks at the head of the OBGYN department and says, "She speaks about it very well." Damn right I speak about it very well, because I worked so hard, because I knew that was what would make an impact on that group of people. And I was there to seek change. So think about that. What is the word choice that you're going to use? What are the details? How do you balance those details? You don't want to get lost in them. You also might find maybe your audience is a recruiter, or maybe it's somebody at this conference. It's going to change the way that you talk about things, right? Maybe you're going to talk about overcoming stage fright, creating strategy to improve efficiency, coming into tech from a non-traditional background, that moment that changed your life from old you to new you. And I want you to think about 3 plot points. That just means like little moments that you can touch on, that you can share with that other person to create a story, a more coherent story. Think about how it started, where did it progress to, and how it ended. I was old Bekah. Today you're meeting new Bekah, and you found out what happened in the middle to get me here today. Does anybody know who Neil Gaiman is? All right, woo. Neil Gaiman is a master storyteller. He does a lot of work with science fiction, and I had the pleasure of hearing him live about 1.5 years ago, and it was magical, right? He inspired me. I knew that I wanted to do more with my life after hearing him read his stories and talk about his craft. And so what does this have to do with innovation? Well, in 2007, China had its first ever state-sponsored science fiction convention, and they invited him to come speak. And Neil Gaiman asked them, like, why now? Why are you doing this now? And they said, well, they historically have been a culture of magical and radical invention, but right now, they could create things, they could follow the directions and make things, but they couldn't imagine things. And they had come over here and they had studied people who, Microsoft, Apple, and Google, and they talked to the inventors there. And what they found was all of those people had one thing in common. They had read science fiction as children. Our stories matter. Fictional stories matter. We are inspired to innovate and to grow when we hear other stories. When I used to teach college English, I taught required courses, so there were a lot of students in there that did not want to be there, and like, why do we have to read? Like, because it gives you practice for real life, right? You learn empathy from reading stories. You learn imagination from reading stories. It is one of those core skills that we overlook and ignore because we think it's a waste of time. I thought, when I majored in English, I thought it was a waste of time. I was going to be a lawyer or a technical writer. Like, why do we need to be creative? And then I learned the power of creativity and how that allows us to connect with other people. We are inspired by stories. And in fact, that there are startups out there that credit some examples of being inspired by science fiction to create the products that they're working on today. What we do know is that we don't have to be the ones always solving the problems. There's different roles in the storytelling process, right? There are people that tell the stories. There are people that create the stories. There are people that take those stories and do something with it. Warby Parker, for example. But sharing these stories, this is what helps us to solve the problem. This is what allows for innovation. It comes out of a desire to solve problems. So another way that you can share, and this might seem a little counterintuitive, but you can improve culture and you can power innovation by talking about your failures. So if you don't like the stories that you've created, think about a time that you failed. And how can you share that story with other people? So my first job out of college, I taught adult basic education, which was people who hadn't graduated high school, and we were teaching them kind of like life skills and stuff like that. And I'll never forget, my boss was like, "Can you teach a math class?" And I'm like, "Yeah, I like math." And so she's like, "Okay, you're gonna teach fractions." And so I came into this classroom, and there were two women there, and I'd prepared, right? I knew what I was doing. I knew fractions, and both of their names were Rebecca, so it was like really weird. But and so I was like up on the board, writing all these things, and like, yeah, I nailed it. I turn around, and one of them is crying. Oh, no, I did not nail it. And so I felt like I had let her down, and I wasn't really sure how to help her. And so we talked through it, and I talked to my boss. I'm like, I really thought I was doing a good job, and I didn't. And so we brainstormed some ways. She was like, okay, not everybody learns in the same way. It's okay. And there's not one way to teach a math problem. If anybody has kids, and you're helping your kids with math, they do it way differently than we did back in my day. There are different approaches that you can take. And so then I went back in there, I recovered, new plan, gave 3 different ways to solve this math problem. And one of those ways clicked with her. So sometimes it's about trying new things. We're going to fail. And I learned a lot about myself in that moment. The senior director of innovation at PayPal, Michael Tedasco, has a miniature failure museum. And I think that that's such a fascinating thing. It's not just there to be like, oh man, like we sucked all of these times, right? It's there to say, look, these are the things that we've tried. And so anyone can have access to understanding that failure is part of the process there. And why is failure an important part of the process? Well, one, when you know that you're allowed to fail, it decreases pressure of perfectionism. And 2, it allows room for risk-taking. And yeah, you're gonna fail when you take risks, but guess what? Your gains are going to be so much greater when you feel comfortable doing that. And it all comes back to that idea of creating a trusting environment. When you're sharing those failures, you're creating trust with the people who are around you. Okay, so one question that I often get is like, how do you tell an effective story? And I could teach a whole entire class on this, but I'm gonna cover the rhetorical triangle, and this goes all the way back to Aristotle. But storytelling drives persuasion, and in some way, it makes us feel something. And maybe you're just persuading someone to be your friend, right? Or maybe you're persuading someone to give you a job. But we have these 3 things called ethos, pathos, and logos. And so far, we've depended a lot in this conversation on pathos. That's the emotional connection that happens. That's that oxytocin that's produced. And then there's ethos, credibility. Why are you credible in this situation? How can you demonstrate your credibility? Well, I've told you a couple of times that I taught college English for 10 years. So I feel like maybe you can intuit that I might be credible to teach you about the rhetorical triangle, right? And then there's the last part, logos. I've talked a bit about neuroscience here. I am not a neuroscientist, but I didn't say I think these things. I've presented you with the evidence from the experts of those things. And so all of these pieces work together to help create a well-rounded story. Now, it's not going to be this all the time for your stories. If you're telling a personal story, you're probably going to rely on one side more than the other. And in this culture of we watch something for 30 seconds, what is the most effective way to get the attention and for people to remember you? It's pathos, right? Like, this is why people are on TikTok for like 7 hours every night, right? Like, you laugh, you feel an emotion, you see the next thing, right? That pathos, that emotional connection gets us involved there. So pathos gets you in the door, but if you want to close the deal, incorporating logos and ethos can really be the thing that's important. So when you go into an interview, you want to leave there and the interviewer says, wow, that person would be really cool and fun to work with. But what's going to close the deal? Wow, that person is going to be really cool and fun to work with, and they're going to knock it out of the park because they know exactly what they're talking about. You want to balance that story. If the purpose of your story is to motivate or persuade someone, then you need to think about ethos and you need to think about logos a little bit more deeply. Think about how you're credible. Think about how you present yourself in a way that shows you know what you're talking about or that you can do the job. Think about how you can make an emotional connection. Who knows who the youngest self-made female millionaire is? Anybody? Yeah. Oprah? It's not Oprah, but that's a really, really good guess. Wait, no. I think did somebody say Spanx? Yeah, good job. Kylie Jenner doesn't count, okay? She's not self-made. Sarah Blakely. Okay, number one, I think Sarah Blakely is hilarious. But her founding story is an example of a really good place to start. It says she was getting ready for a party when she realized she didn't have the right undergarment to provide a smooth look under her white pants. Armed with scissors and sheer genius, she cut the feet off her control top pantyhose, and the Spanx revolution began. With a focus on solving wardrobe woes, the Spanx brand has grown to offer bras, underwear, leggings, active, and more. Spanx has secured its place in women's hearts and in pop culture with daily mentions everywhere from CNN to SNL. This does a good job of utilizing the rhetorical triangle. They capture the moment of inception. They demonstrate credibility by mentioning CNN, Forbes magazines, and Time, but they also showcase their personality when they say they don't really take themselves too seriously, and when they mention SNL. But at the very bottom of there, this gets back to that idea of we want to be involved in a cause. It says, in addition to keeping butts covered from Savannah to Singapore, Spanx also shapes the world by focusing on our mission, to help women feel great about themselves and their potential. So again, there's that feeling that comes from that last line there. And I know I'm running short on time, so try and get through. Wow, I have a lot of slides left. Okay, so from the Dana Foundation talks about this idea that when you connect to other people, your vagal nerve activity increases along with your attention, and you can care even more and relate to your storyteller by putting yourself in the story. You're more likely to remember when that happens. So making these connections helps us to empathize with the people around us and put ourselves in their position. And this cultivates those relationships. Okay, so we're gonna jump into military intelligence just for a minute because I think this is really fascinating. There's this company out there called Useful Fiction. They create fictional intelligence. They're breaking down traditionally dense and dry information, and they're weaving narrative in it to be more effective. So they're taking military documentation and they're teaching strategists how to put stories in there to be able to share the message with other people. They're doing this to be more effective. And as part of this, they're finding that they're effective in getting people on board with the idea. So you can say, this is what we're doing. Here are the spreadsheets that show why we should be doing it. And then you can expect your team to be on board with that because they have to. Or you can tell them a story that allows them to relate to that situation, to connect with it, and then they know why they want to be a part of that story, why they want to be on board with this, and they'll connect with it. So there's more effectiveness when somebody feels personally motivated to be involved in whatever mission that you're trying to achieve. And you don't do that by handing them spreadsheets. Or at least, please don't hand me spreadsheets. That is not effective. I really love this quote by this magician: whoever tells the best story wins. They win the conversation, They win the friendship. They win a spot in your memories. And so we need to think about our audience. We need to think about our own attitudes and how they've changed, our own experiences, and what's been an effective way in better understanding ourselves. Thinking about being vulnerable and open with your storytelling. Sorry, I thought I skipped it. So why is storytelling important in a digital world? Why is it important to us in tech? We have the space to make connections, but we have to make the time. We have to have those opportunities. It's about connecting ourselves to our family and to our friends, to our teammates, and to other people, and recognizing that they're complex human beings who are in front of you. They have lives outside of this moment, outside of their roles. They have issues that you might not know that they're dealing with. Everybody has a story, and we don't know what those stories are. We don't know if they're sharing it. But remembering that we all have stories is going to allow us to continue to make those exceptions. Katie's story brought the message of patient care reform to hospitals. It inspired me to work towards hospital reform as well and to help so many other people. She shared her story in as many ways as she could. So let's go back to thinking about your story. In that idea of tell me about yourself, think about how you can show value, how you can motivate your audience or connect to other people, how you can persuade your audience. Maybe you motivate, maybe you show value by saying, I onboarded 1,000 new open source contributors last year. Maybe you motivate them. I made it into tech after my CS professor told me that I would never pass my classes. Maybe you're connecting to others by saying, hey, I went to boot camp too. Think about the story that you want to tell. All right, starting to wrap it up here. I've got 1 minute, but I'm probably going to take 3. This might seem counterintuitive, but it's important to talk about listening. Has anybody here read Chris Voss's Never Split the Difference? Yes. Oh, okay. Everybody else, you need to read it. It's very fantastic. He's a former hostage negotiator, and I have used his tactics on toddlers, and they work. So you learn through listening. Connection isn't just a one-way street. When you are listening to somebody else's story, don't think, this is how I'm going to respond to the story, or I can't wait to jump in and say this next thing, or what should I say next? Listen without the intent of responding. Listen to know and to understand that person. Chris Voss says, listening is a martial art. It balances the subtle behaviors of emotional intelligence and the assertive skills of influence to gain access to the mind. When we listen to others, we're more likely to have those connections happen in our own brains and also to know how to connect back with them. Okay, so here's my challenge to you. We need storytelling. We need it to connect. We need it to learn. We need it for psychological safety, to empathize with the struggles of others, so we can feel excited for other people when they succeed and when they overcome adversity. We want to listen to each other first, no lists, no job titles, learn about that person. This is the first talk of the day. You have the rest of the day to tell your story and to listen to someone else's story. So my challenge to you is, some point today, find another person that you don't know, share your story, or listen to theirs. Thank you.